Dr. Leidig, I'm so happy to have gotten in touch with you because I think we are on absolutely the same wavelength on this concept of Hindutva. I saw it and I got really interested, really concerned. I think anybody involved in politics knows what a lot of these buzzwords are, such as right wing and far right. And if you're watching the video version of the podcast, we got a nice title today, and it says far right extremism. So we're going pretty heavy, but we do have the doctor in the house, and I'm really happy to talk with Dr. Leidig, but she's requested that we call her Eviane. So we're going to do that, but going to absolutely give her a proper introduction. She is over at the Norwegian School of Theology. She's a postdoctoral fellow over there in religion society, and she works at the Intersect Project, which is doing some amazing research on intersecting flows of Islamophobia, which is kind of the reason, some of the reasons I got involved in Hindutva as well was the Islamophobia stuff. So I'm glad you're involved in that side. So check out the Intersect Project. We'll put all the links in the description. She's also an affiliate at the Center for Research on Extremism, CREX, I love the names, at University of Oslo. And her current research compares the role of women in the far right in India and North America, and looking in particular at influencers on social media who promote Hindu nationalist and alt-right narratives, respectively, and the transnational connections between these movements. She received her PhD in sociology from University of Oslo, and the dissertation was on transnational connections of the far right between India and the West. Through diaspora supporters of Brexit and Trump in the UK and the US. So a lot of relevant connections. This is going to be exciting, and thank you so much for your work, and thank you so much for your time, Eviane.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited for our discussion today.
Yeah, I try to always butter up the guests in the beginning because you've done a lot of great work. But what sparked your interest in like Hindu nationalism or Hindutva?
Yeah, well, I have been researching Islamophobia for several years, so sort of on similar path as you've mentioned. And at the same time, I had been researching South Asia, and in particular looking at Muslims in South Asia. That's where I wrote my bachelor's thesis and then also my master's. But it was really in 2014 when Modi got elected for the first time that I started to follow Hindu nationalism more and more closely. And when I set out to do my PhD, I had realized that, when we talk about things like far right extremism or right wing extremism, like things like Hindu nationalism is like lacking in that conversation. And I think, there's a lot of ignorance when we talk about things like the far right because things like Hindu nationalism is not included in that conversation. So that really set me out in sort of conceptualizing Hindu nationalism as really the sort of global far right family, as we can call it. So I mean, that's how I sort of got into it. And then it was sort of with the election of Trump, which is when I had started my PhD in 2016. And I started to notice a lot of Hindu nationalists that were supporting Trump. So that sort of got me then into this rabbit hole of looking into that for my dissertation, and then sort of looking at the flows and the connections between Hindu nationalism in India, how it sort of gets promoted through the diaspora in the UK and the US, and how this then connects to like the Trump campaign in 2016, to the Brexit referendum in 2016 as well.
I've had a lot of Twitter back and forth with some of those social media influencers you mentioned, and it's very almost disturbing in a sense the way that Hindutva can get packaged in almost a social justice format. Is that it really can kind of slip into this post-colonial world, slip into this privileged world, and we have to be really sensitive, of course. And there's a lot of obsession with ancestry today and skin color and gender and identity. And I think especially, on this channel, we have so many videos on House of Del Vento delineating Hindutva from Hinduism, because religion's always been a very important part of my life. And I very rarely go on the religious angle. But as your paper, which I'm going to kind of center the discussion around from 2020, which is called Hindutva as a Variant of Right-Wing Extremism, it touches on religious aspect a little bit, barely.
Mhm.
But we always have to say, especially to those listening, that in all of these discussions, and I grew up in the days where the Islamic terrorism canard was all over the place. So in all discussions of extremism, whether it's God hates fags on the streets, QAnon, if it's Islamic terrorism, if there's abortion center bombers, any ideology, my perspective is to be very sensitive and very nuanced with the language, even just as a common person, just from my lived experience, what I've lived through with religion. And I like that you touched on the religious aspect, but you didn't harp on it too much. And I just wanted to open up the space a little bit at the beginning of the podcast. Did you want to say anything about your thoughts about how Hinduism and how religion ties into this far right extremism? Because I think there is a uniqueness in Hindu nationalism that it's more overt, that we might, and in many ways it's similar to the old Islamic discussion of 10, 15 years ago, but I think we lost a lot of nuance back in those days. So what are your thoughts on that? And I just wanted to open up the space if you wanted to say anything. If there's any Hindus listening, we don't want to offend. It's something I try my best to be really clear about, because it is such a complicated discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also want to be very careful and very clear in saying that we are making this distinction between Hinduism and Hindutva or Hindu nationalism. And when I talk about Hindutva, I am referring specifically to Hindu nationalism, which aims to create a Hindu Rashtra or state in India. And I think, it's important to foreground the idea that Hindu nationalism is, even for the founders of Hindutva, things like religion was seen as secondary to being a Hindu. It was about blood and soil. It was about being born on a specific territory, which made one Hindu. And so it's really like a very racialized understanding of what a Hindu is, right? So, and I absolutely agree with you. Like, we're not talking about Hinduism here. I have great respect for Hinduism, but we're talking about a very specific political ideology when we talk about Hinduism.
Absolutely. And I think when you have so much powerful nuance and clear research, you can also use very powerful language to prove your point. And your paper starts off straight up. There is currently a right-wing extremist party governing the world's largest democracy, yet it is remarkably absent in the literature on right-wing extremism. I put on my glasses today to try to read everything properly because we have the doctor on, and I still mess up my words. I'm sorry, because that was such a powerful opening statement. But you said right-wing extremist party. So I had a psychologist on a couple of days ago, and Prithvi used the term right-wing as well. And I pushed back a little bit. I said, okay, if I'm a Hindutva nationalist, I'm going to say right-wing. That's an American concept. That's European. What is right? What is left? So what is your definition of right-wing? And how are you using right-wing? And what is your definition of extremist? So let's unpack that sentence, because it's powerful and it's very polemic, right? And I like the approach.
Yeah, so we're getting really into the nitty gritty here on terminology, but for right wing, yeah. So I mean, there's certainly an argument to be made that this is like a very American or very European understanding of what's right wing and what's left wing. But with right wing, there's very sort of defined principles that concern conservative thoughts. I mean, we can go all the way to the philosophy of that. Focus on nationalism. And I'm talking about like a very exclusionary form of nationalism, right? Not one that's very inclusive, but one that's very centered upon, perhaps certain, to get nitty gritty, primordialist things that cannot change about one's identity, whether that be, race, for example. And with extremists, I would say that it's one that takes the political ideology to the extreme in such a way that there is no compromise, right? It's sort of moving beyond radical towards moving an extreme interpretation of that ideology. So yeah, in terms of those definitions, that's sort of what I had in mind when I wrote that for the article.
Well, no, it's important because your whole point is to put this into the lexicon, because if you go on the streets, basically anywhere in the world, and you say far right, I think anyone from Gen Z to a true boomer is going to have an image in their head of a far right, perhaps of a white authoritarian leader with a suit, perhaps a Trump figure. So in terms of the Nazi connection with Hindutva, because you've cited some amazing evidence, what is the direct evidence, to just hit people hard at the beginning of the podcast, of actual Nazis, actual card-carrying Nazis, Nazi ideologues with the original Hindutva ideologues, because we know that we're talking about the Hindutva of the 1920s and 30s. So the Savarkar, what are the connections here? Because you hear it hinted at in a lot of articles, but you dug down and found the sources. So what is the actual connection of the Nazis and Hindutva?
Well, yeah, as I allude to in the article, so I reference pure academic research, which has documented archives of the exchanges that sort of early founders of Hindutva had with Nazi Germany. And these are both things that happened officially and unofficially. So it's things like writing newspaper editorials to each other, letter correspondences, being cited in various propaganda pamphlets and manifestos, and even things like covert intelligence operations, sort of spies for the Axis powers and so forth. And it's not just Nazis that these relationships were built, but also Italian fascists as well. I mean, the organization of the RSS itself is modeled after Mussolini's black shirts. So I mean, there's a very sustained connection here, and I want to also make clear that when it comes to Hindutva, I think it's easy to look at it as this very sort of isolated movement and ideology. But as I try to claim in the article, Hindutva from its inception was a very globally oriented ideology, right? It emerged out of relationships that were built with other sort of far right extremist movements that were happening at the time.
Yeah, and what are those pangs in that? I mean, if you put yourself in perspective, like right now, there's a whole vibe in the world of a certain feeling. If you're in the 60s, there's a whole vibe. Like if you're in the 20s, after World War I, there's a lot of nationalist literature. I mean, so I understand the context, that brotherhood, that unity, that powerful nationalism. But if people can just put themselves in that context, that it is kind of this just European fascism. And when I saw it myself, I said, yeah, this is very kind of European fascisty. But what specifically are some of those, that connective tissue, the racial, the ethno, that, may have given Hindutva its context of why Savarkar may have written such a thing, you know?
Well, I do think it's important to remember that the founders of Hindutva were extremely well educated, well read men. And of course, it's just men in this case. I mean, they were reading European philosophers on nationalism. And during that time, during colonialism, theories of nationalism were all rooted in notions of race and language and territory. And this really influenced their ideas for Hindutva. And if we look even further at specific elements within Hindutva, for instance, the sort of anti-Christian, anti-Muslim aspects of Hindutva, I mean, the anti-Christian sentiments that was developed because of Christian missionaries that were present in the subcontinent. But I think what's really interesting about the anti-Muslim dimension of Hindutva is that it was because these founders of Hindutva were reading scholars of Orientalism, so scholars that were sort of driving the sort of colonial agenda, that were depicting, Muslim men and women in very specific ways. And this was an idea that really didn't, I mean, when you look at early writings of Hindutva, it's just very distinctively anti-Christian because it's seen as a foreign invasion. But if you then look at, the subsequent decades of writings in Hindutva, that's when it takes the sort of anti-Muslim turn, and that was further compounded by the British divide and rule strategy, putting Hindus and Muslims into different religious categories, despite the fact that up until that point, I mean, someone who was an upper class Hindu had more in common with an upper class Muslim, for instance, than perhaps like a lower class Hindu. So that's just an example. I think going back to your point, what is it specifically that Hindu nationalism shares with other sort of far right extremist movements in Europe? I mean, it's really compounded in, I think, sort of five or four key elements, which is that based of race, language, territory, religion, of course, but not as strong as the others. Did I say five? Maybe it was four. I think I outlined it in the article. But I mean, these components that are seen as composing, what is a Hindu identity, what it means to be a Hindu for these Hindu nationalist writers.
It's that manufactured identity when I see it. And that's why, some people want to go back to the ancient millennium in this debate, but for the Hindutva discussion, most of what we're talking about is an ideology of the past 100 years. And honestly, I feel like inside India, because I have a lot of followers from India. I mean, thousands of them, and it wasn't overt. It's just people are really into this. But inside India, there's not and I don't want to speak for 1.5 billion. I'm just going to use a generality that there's not much of a obsession with this discussion of Hindutva versus Hinduism. It really isn't, because and I think there's a reason for that, because in our context, we want to be hyper specific. But in India, a lot of the pushback, I would get on Twitter or something from the ideologues is that Hindutva is just a Sanskrit meaning of tva. It's just Hindutva, Hindu-ness. It's just the idea of Hindu Dharma, Hindu-ness, and Hinduism is just a European term. And then they go off and off and off and off. So, on the academic side, I mean, there's tons of literature using Hindutva, but I mean, Hindutva is also used as its own kind of canard as well. So how do you deal with that pushback? Is that, Hindutva is not just, Savarkar and not just, a few RSS writings and a few things like that. Hindutva is actually, this is just a proper Indian nationalist thing, because that's a very, strong retort, and they would, fall back on the Sanskrit and things like that. How would you deal with that?
Mm. I mean, that is true, and we need to be nuanced about that. But it's more about how those ideas have then been weaponized into a movement that is a bit more problematic, right? So this, you're asking me very tough questions, but they're good questions. I like this. I like this challenge.
Hindutva and I
Yeah.
go, I don't want to say way back, but it feels like we were just meant for each other, because it's like, I don't know. It's just, the topic is I just find it fascinating. I'm sorry if I was really looking forward to having you here, because I don't think a lot of people can handle these questions. So, I mean, I just, forgive me if I'm
No, it's
going
fine. It's
hard
fine.
at
I
it, but
like the challenge.
welcome to the House of Del Vento. So you also use the term saffron terror in your paper, which I like very much. I got peaked to the violence and the terrorism as well. I mean, there's threads and threads on this. There's a history of it. You also have, if you don't want to read Dr. Leidig's, Eviane's paper, you should. But if you want just a quick article, she also has this great piece by the Global Network on Extremism and Technology called "Far Right Terrorism is Global, but Coverage is Not: Hindu Nationalist Violence in India." And this is another reason why I got into this, is because I feel like I have had decades of hearing about certain forms of terrorism, and it's in the zeitgeist. We know about it. Far right terrorism is global. And again, you're trying to get this Hindu nationalist violence into the zeitgeist, because we've had the cow lynchings, the Delhi riots, the pogroms. We had the current president preside over a literal pogrom in 2002. I mean, we have serious documented elements of violence that are not in the zeitgeist for certain reasons. And you have just a very great short piece, and you're very good at, conceptualizing all this about this topic. So, in the world of US, UK, Brazil, I mean, far right terrorism all over the place, where do you feel Hindu nationalist violence fits in? Why do you think the coverage is not so proportional in this regard?
Yeah, so I would say that also what prompted me to write this piece is that there was a 17-year-old shooter who live streamed his attack on Facebook, targeting anti-CAA protesters at Jamia Millia Islamia University last February. And it was striking because when we see a far-right terrorist attack happen, it's usually covered all over the media. And when I say we see this, it's predominantly in North America and Europe that you see just these clickbait headlines and people trying to decipher this terrorist attack. And it was very striking to me as somebody in this world to see that this shooter was not at all covered in the media. I mean, and very few articles in India too, actually, I should point out. So that sort of motivated me to write this article, as you see there.
Well, the
Oh
world
no, I know
also
I just
has
got.
this fascination with like online radicalization, and we just did a whole interview with a psychologist on this as well. Like the world right now, if there's a live streamed beheading or a live stream riot, I mean, the world is obsessed with looking into the shooters. And with Hindutva, this is here as well. I mean, you start it with hey, there's a right-wing terrorist in Germany who streamed his video. Well, there's Christchurch, there's El Paso. Well, it
Mhm.
also happens with Hindu nationalism. Why aren't people listening? So I like that. You also mentioned the digital connection, because the online radicalization is, I feel like it's fierce with Hindutva, and it's a central element to this modern beast that it is the online aspect.
They did more research on this individual. It was found how he was, spreading all this fake news on Facebook and WhatsApp. And obviously, we can go into another tangent just about that and the role of the internet.
Go for it, please,
But
because
yeah,
I think I think it's relevant. The WhatsApp killings. I was talking to my mother the other day. She doesn't know what WhatsApp is, so it is a
oh
very niche conversation. But I'm a member of several WhatsApp groups for my business and my personal life and stuff, and it's great. But you could also, I have a clip of a Hindu nationalist ideologue, a lady, kind of a religious teacher in India, who said she had 1 million access to 1 million people on her phone with WhatsApp. So it's obviously a
yeah,
powerful thing. And with fake news, there's like, oh, look at the Muslims, they slaughtered a cow, let's go do something. Or look at the Muslims, he's out with a Hindu girl. So there is that Islamophobic thing, but there's, the online, the WhatsApp stuff is a really big deal. So if you wanted to go off on it, go right ahead, because I think it's central to, it's not what your first paper's about, but if you wanted to, I'd love to hear your perspective. Um,
yeah. I mean, I don't want to go into too much of a tangent, but I mean, I just wanted to add that it's it's important to highlight that all this sort of WhatsApp and Facebook activity, it's not purely organic either. A lot of it is sort of orchestrated top down. The BJP has these IT cells, for instance, where they hire thousands of volunteers every day to create WhatsApp groups and forward messages, forward fake content. So, I mean, it's quite astounding to see sort of the sort of very top down nature of how some of this propaganda is being spread and circulated. So this is sort of another area that I'm interested in looking at the moment, is sort of also like how tech companies sort of turn a blind eye when it comes to this type of activity in India, and then how that affects things like their recruitment and radicalization and mobilization on these platforms. But I think I wanted to turn back then to something you had asked, which is also why people commonly don't recognize Hindutva in the West. I mean, I think it boils down to two main points. The first is that I think there's a lot of lack of knowledge about Hindu nationalism in India, and it's starting to come out. I think particularly with the government's actions in Kashmir, and then with the CAA and the Delhi riots. I think there's more international attention that's being paid to India, and this recognition of sort of what Modi's government is trying to push for us. But I mean, a lot of that's done to great work by journalists that we see writing about this stuff in the US. Okay. But I think another issue why this is sort of overlooked is also that India is frankly considered to be an ally to Western countries in the region, right? It's seen to be the sort of democratic stronghold that pushes against, Islamist terrorism. Ever since the war on terror, India's become a partner and ally to Western countries in the region. So there's a tendency to not want to sort of offend India in that sense, right? And you're working with a very delicate situation where it's not just like in the U.S. with sort of anti-government militia groups, and obviously Trump has sort of changed the landscape there, but like it's quite a different situation there as opposed to in India, where you see Hindutva has become totally mainstream. And it has such widespread popular support as well, right? It's not just like in the US where you might see some fringe people that support some of these militia groups and so forth, right? So I think it's important to recognize that these two facets: one, the sort of lack of recognition, and then the secondly that India is seen as an ally, and it should be an ally. So this is something I get pushed back a lot, which is that you know India, it's fundamentally a democracy, and so there is hope there, right? There's hope that we can work with actors in the country. So I don't want to sort of disregard this and sort of not acknowledge that either, right? Like, because India is a democracy, we should sort of help promote its inclusiveness and its pluralism in the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when people start talking about Pakistan and stuff like that, I'm like, yeah, I'll definitely talk about it. I mean, I have a lot of experience with Pakistan, but it's almost like to the point where the discussion is like, I don't want to use the term lost cause, but it's like they're set. I mean, it's an Islamic republic. It's declared. It is what it's.
Yeah.
That's what the Constitution. That's the ramifications are there. But India has a constitution. It's a secular democracy, right? Apparently. And then when you
Yeah.
see the Hindutva kind of forces, especially from the academic perspective, I like what you do is that you don't make it really all about India because it's a global thing. You know, the Norway shooter, he was reading
Hmm.
Hindutva stuff. And you make all these international connections. So I think if people understood the international ramifications and the global ramifications of Hindutva stuff, they would wake up a little bit. So, what would you say about that? I mean, what are the global ramifications of Hindutva being on the rise in India? In text, in media, in politics, in idea, and the connections. What does this mean for the world? Why should people listen?
Well, besides the fact that it's the world's largest democracy, I think that's a good enough reason in there. But I mean, in terms of its global connections, I mean, when I was writing my dissertation, I mean, what sparked my interest in sort of seeing the connections between Modi and Trump was simply the fact that they called each other brothers, and so that sort of sparked my connection in tracing sort of Hindu nationalism's global impact. But even something I've written quite recently in foreign policy, I document how during the lockdown in Kashmir, even Indian MPs and journalists weren't allowed into the region, yet a group of European members of parliament visited Kashmir. And it was technically an unofficial visit, but it was a visit facilitated by organizations based in Brussels, which lobby on behalf of the Indian government for a sort of a Hindu nationalist agenda. And so, when I wrote this article, some people said to me, okay, so we see a group of mostly far right members of the European Parliament visiting Kashmir, but so what? How, this could just be a one time trip. Why is it so important? And it was later revealed how a few months after this trip, with the passage of the CAA in India, this issue got put onto the table in the European Parliament. And those members of the European Parliament who had visited Kashmir lobbied against the bill being discussed in the Parliament, saying that this is an internal matter to India and that the international community should not intervene because it's a domestic issue for India. So I think we're starting to see how the global far right is starting to sort of coordinate and work together at different scales. So, on the one hand, you have these elected members of parliament, these politicians that are working together in sort of diplomatic channels. And then on the other hand, you have these sort of online communities. So, a lot of my work, I've seen sort of Hindu nationalists on sites like 4chan, Gab, Parlor, which has been shut down now. But I've been tracing a lot of the sort of fringe communities as well. And then I've been seeing how certain tropes get shared, let's say certain Islamophobic content gets shared, and certain conspiracies about the coronavirus. And so
The Hindu nationalist trolls are really like no other online. If you
yeah.
want to go down the Twitter rabbit hole, go ahead. And I'm sorry if any of them come at you, Eviane, after this, they probably will. But
Oh,
it.
I'm used to it, unfortunately. Yeah, it's just part of the job.
What are the connections between right wing trolls? They all seem to have some type of, I noticed, misogyny, some type of narcissism, some fatalism. They tend to love anonymity. I mean, but with Hindutva, there is, I mean, you always bring it back to Islamophobia, which I like. But what are some of these? I mean, I kind of, we posted a thread on it this morning, like what makes Hindutva trolls so unique. But what are your thoughts about, because that says something about the ideology. What are your thoughts about what makes these Hindutva trolls so unique?
I mean, for me,
After you.
if you consider the fact that since the 1990s, Hindu nationalists have been online spreading content, I mean, this is like this type of behavior has been. So I write in my work how sort of Hindu nationalism spread overseas and through tech, through the diaspora who are working in IT, and sort of how their skills were being exploited by groups like the RSS, VHP, BJP in order to sort of spread content in these online communities. And this has been well documented. They're called internet Hindus or cyber Hindus. That's sort of how they've been discussed by academics. And they're sort of very aggressive, male-dominated sort of trolls, essentially, online. And so when I consider the fact that this type of trolling behavior is, like 30 years in the making, it's not so surprising to me.
I'm going to plug this book. I'm going to do a little segue because there has been, we're not going to talk about it too much here. We just kind of wanted to briefly hit on the trolls, but there's a lot of great academic and popular writing on the subject of the BJP IT cell trolls, the paid trolls,
Mm-hmm.
the virtual Hindus, the internet Hindus, as you said. So I recommend this book because it's from 2019. There's also a book by Swati Chaturvedi from 2016. And we also talked with Sanjukta on an earlier podcast about that.
Anything that's seen to be sort of inauthentic and impure is something that's foreign, right? So even just take something like feminism, right? So I'm looking at sort of these female Hindu nationalist influencers, right? And I love to hark on about feminism because feminism is something that's an import from the West, right? This is a foreign concept that's been applied. And that's kind of a theme that runs throughout all of Hindu nationalism, right? It's about this seeking towards the golden age, towards this pure state of being before the British, before the Mughals, towards try to find something that's quite indigenous and that's quite authentic. But then what happens with that is that something that seemed to be indigenous is then tied to something that's somehow innately conservative or something that's innately traditionalist, which isn't really the case, right? Like it's an interesting slippage in that sense. But yeah, I can see what you mean in terms of sort of it's very sort of anti-Western, anti-colonial roots is what gives it, I think, this sort of unique dimension. Right, because Hindu nationalism is something that sprung out of an anti-colonial resistance movement, right? So out of that, you had a very sort of unique ideology unfold because of that.
But then it became Islamophobic, right? And that's the connection, and that's what gives it. And then the Muslim has always been, the one of the strongest canards of the past couple decades. But I mean, and then it became Islamophobic in like the 20s, and then obviously there was partition, and there's obviously a lot of cultural bad blood there. But then you mentioned the colonial interpretation of history. I talk about that a lot, and I've been attracted to it a lot because I like Islamic history, and we're going to have some Islamic historians on this channel. It's very fascinating. Even that term is not even a right way. Even the quote unquote Dharmic writers use the term Turk most of the time. So it's like this whole idea of Islamic history is something we've been stuck with. But I like the history; it's really good. But Hindutva ideologues, the textbook writers, the day-to-day brainwashing is all about the Islamic invader, the Hindu victim, warning to the Hindus, all these type of things. And it's been going on for a long time. And it's like deeply ingrained in the mind. The whole narrative is there. They can Google Voice of India publishers whenever they want and get all the books to say, here, our 60,000 temples are destroyed. And it's a lot of it has to do with Islam. So did it go from anti-colonial to anti-Islam out of convenience, or I just wonder where the selective reading of the facts came from, because the facts are there. I mean, the sources are there. We know what goes, but like, where did this historiography come from? And because this Islamophobia was way before 9/11, this was in the 30s, 40s. So why where's the Hindu Muslim bye-bye? Like, so where do you think it went from anti-imperialism to anti-Islam so strongly?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually going into some of the very sort of detailed history of looking at the Hindutva writings. I believe it was amplified. I feel so bad for forgetting the year, but it was really amplified when the British passed this law, which allowed Hindus to only vote for Hindus and Muslims to only vote for Muslims in local elections, right? This really helped then solidify these artificial divisions, right? I'm not saying that Hindus and Muslims have always sort of coexisted peacefully throughout the subcontinent. That's clearly not true. But what happened was it became categories of ways that people started to identify themselves into these religious tribes. And it was really through that, and then sort of the political processes of trying to gain recognition that sort of led then to the developments of this sort of shift from just purely anti-colonial towards anti-Muslim. And it's important to recognize that during that time, it was also the founding of the All India Muslim League. So we started to see a lot of Muslim political leaders start to consolidate and mobilize along these lines too, right? And then eventually just in the run up to independence just became further catalyzed by these religious divisions.
There's a quote in your paper that this phenomenon in India has resulted in a strategic coalition of religious groups and the neo-middle classes, described as a new cultural identitarian political movement that emerged out of the neoliberal political economy. Thus, even though Hindutva began to be mainstream in the 1990s, under Modi, it is arguably more widely accepted across all socioeconomic classes in Indian society. And that's the thing. A lot of the time when you click on the trolls, you have your anonymous trolls, but then you have your doctors, your lawyers, your engineers, your teachers, your ex-army sergeants. And I said, whoa, okay. Do you really hate Muslims this much when you look at their pages? And I said, wow. Okay, so it's like, so I like that you use the term middle class, things like that. But what is the role of the BJP in that? Because is that just an electoral coalition? Is that your silent majority? You know, what is the role? Is the BJP just playing politics? Do they, you know, has this always been their plan? Is it a sinister thing? Is it just politics? I mean, why did you include BJP in your paper in this regard?
Well, I mean, the reason I did include BJP in the paper was also to focus on sort of how Hindutva manifests in a very successful political party, right? And let's bear in mind, I'm writing this for academics who, as I mentioned, don't really know anything about Hindu nationalism. So I'm trying to forward this claim. I mean, it's interesting because Hindu nationalism, from its origins, has always been a very elite-driven phenomenon, and in a way, Modi almost sort of democratized it to a sense, right? Like,
That's
you know, who
changed,
he
though.
is as a person. Yeah, it's
had a
changed.
trickle down. Yeah, it's strange.
Even though Hindu nationalists are very, very neoliberal, and it's sort of this tension between sort of like a protectionist economic agenda versus a very neoliberal one, and Modi is a very neoliberal one. And it was when India neoliberalized in 1991, they saw this space, this political opportunity to sort of seize and be the party that would represent neoliberalism in sort of the future for India. So it was at that point that they started to sort of gain a lot of interest and followers, voters and supporters, really. I mean, I guess it'd be useful to sort of separate Modi from the BJP as well, like in the sense that, you know, I think with Modi's ascent and his social mobility, he really became this figure for many sort of the lower middle class to aspire to, right? I mean, that's why he is so popular amongst these young men who move to cities and, you know, they might work in sort of these like service jobs, but, you know, they're really attracted to Modi and what he represents. So, I mean, the political scientist, Christophe Jaffrelot, he writes about this neo-middle class phenomenon in India. So that's people who are sort of emerging into this new middle class position because India is changing quite significantly in terms of its society, its economy, right? I mean, just tie Modi to the fact that he wants India to be a 21st century powerhouse in technology, for example, right? And so this is something that, you know, it's a very sort of utopian vision in some ways, right?
With a Modi BJP mob, same. You see a lot of the men, young people, a few old people, different. I mean, all walks of life. We have to be honest that we can't generalize, but you see the similar demographics. You're right about the young men, but you know there is nuance there. But I think it is powerful to say that there is a young male hope there with these authoritarian leaders that we see all over the world. And I think part of that, you know, Modi is really good at that. But I mean, these mobs are all over the place. I mean, Trump's legacy is like basically destroyed. I mean, it should have been, but Modi's got these mobs. He's got these, you know, love jihad networks that have been emboldened during his, you know, his reign that can now feel great about going around and stalking Hindu Muslim couples, these young kids and, you know, young people that should probably be working that are just on, you know, tweeting all day and stuff like that. So it's this whole new culture with young men, and Trump did the same thing in America. I mean, it's a whole far right network. So I hope those pictures made it obvious. But if you're watching on the audio podcast, what I showed is just the mob, a saffron BJP mob, and the kind of QAnon, whatever you want to call it, mob that stormed the Capitol. And you see the young men, but you also see pockets of diversity and pockets of different age groups. So
These images of young men engaging in mobs. I mean, this is such an interesting fascination because this is something we see across all far right extremist movements, right? We see young men out there visibly, aggressively, violently in the streets. And then we don't see women in these pictures, not very often, right? So this is actually work that I'm doing at the moment, which is, I mean, in Hindu nationalism, it's a bit different because there are, there are cases of powerful female leaders out there inciting riots and whatnot. But historically, um, but I mean, it's an interesting division of labor, right? We see young men out there in public on the streets being very aggressive in sort of taking up their presence and their dominance in these spaces. But we often see sort of women that are supporting their men out there in the streets, but they're sort of working in the private, or they're working in the sort of behind the scenes, right? So what I've been looking at are how nationalist women are sort of sharing on social media with their followers a lot of the same sort of propaganda and same images, but doing so in ways that are aesthetically pleasing. And this is what I noticed actually with insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. So while everybody was watching young men storming the Capitol, I was actually watching a lot of these alt-right women who were sort of engaging in live streams talking about how they're supporting their men out there in the streets, right? So this is something that we see across all far-right extremist movements. And I just wanted to put that out there because it is important to think about the gender dimensions of how this is sort of manifested in different ways of support with men and with women in these organizations and these movements.
there's also the idea of motherhood in the traditional Hindu nationalist discourse. It's the mother Bharat, and there's a good article called "Women in Hindutva," and there's this idea of you could be basically the child bearer, or you can be like the ideologue. So there is an empowerment ideology there too that works. So it's just all these ideologies are so very deep, and you see it in the far right, like you said. You saw it in, I mean, how many documentaries have there been about ISIS brides, for crying out loud? I mean,
Yeah.
you got a 10-part series here, you got an 8-part series, you got a 4-part series, you got this. It's like, all right, we get it. So you touch on about this figure in your writing as well, that German alt-right connection, Savitri Devi, who, some Hindutva ideologues actually denounce her, but at the end of the day, she does have there's this strange connection that's there that you really try to pick apart. What would you say about her? She's this mythical, I mean, she's like a Hitlerian fascist, basically, right? And she's obsessed with the Aryan myth, right? That's her thing. But what's her deal?
Yeah, Savitri Devi is a very interesting character. And if you want to know more about her, there's a great book by Nicholas Goodrick Clark where he basically writes like a biography of her and sort of her fascination with Aryanism. I mean, so Savitri Devi was a figure who sort of how do I even try to summarize her? She's a figure who was quite prominent in sort of bringing together Nazism and Hindu nationalism together under the guise of, or rather under the strain of Aryanism, and she tries to really connect some of these racial elements between these ideologies, and she builds upon the sort of Indo-European roots of the Vedas in order to sort of connect together its connections with Northern Europe, right? So she draws upon the genetic and the linguistic roots of Indo-European Aryanism in this sense. But I don't know how much more I can add about her, but I think she was quite a pivotal figure during the Second World War, and she even engaged in covert intelligence operations on behalf of the Germans while she was living in Calcutta with her husband, who was the publisher of a National Socialist paper
Well,
in India. So
well, that's a whole rabbit hole for sure. And there's even
yeah,
Southern slave owners in America that were writing about Aryan blood and Hindu supremacy and things like that. So that's a whole nother debate. And there are deep supremacist right wing connections here, folks. And again, this is like this highbrow academic kind of discussion, but this is where I like coming at it, picking apart the Hindutva ideology, what it means to the world. This is what Dr. Leidig has written about. And I would like to show one example and kind of come back to the woman discussion because, let's always make sure we be fair, and this is always fun
Cover
for
our bases here.
yeah, well, yeah, and this is always fun for a guy to participate into
Yeah.
and just sit back. But hey, I mean, it's honest. So here's a clip I'd like to play. It's just a minute long. I'd love to hear your comments on it. Again, there's religious undertones here, but the ideology here, this is what the kind of stuff that's gotten emboldened under Modi, and what it involves the paranoia and the lynchings and technology. Here we go, folks.
The group's firebrand Hindu leader, Kamal Didi, accuses Muslim traders who dominate the meat industry of rampantly smuggling cows. On the outskirts of Jaipur, Kamal Didi meets her volunteers. They tell her they rescued a cow from smugglers after an informant tipped them off. The group says this bull was intentionally injured to make it easier to smuggle. Kamal Didi says she won't shy away from violence if needed. We will do whatever it takes to save cows. We won't let cows be slaughtered. If anyone even looks at a cow, we'll gouge their eyes out. We're not scared of the consequences.
And I know folks in India are definitely probably sick of hearing about cow lynching, but to those that are newly, into the subject, that's been a central part of the early thing. It was a huge conflict. It's kind of gone down a little bit, but the emboldenment, and when I saw there is just like it's like mom giving you permission. It's like a mother just telling you, oh, she says it's okay. I mean, I saw, not like my mom, but I saw, I kind of felt like it's just like a bunch of family sitting behind their mom, just doing what they have to do. I mean, it's, the psychology there is so twisted, but it is a reality.
Yeah. So, I mean, the primary role for women in Hindu nationalism is to be mothers and wives and caretakers, right? Now, what I do find really interesting about Hindu nationalism compared to other far right movements is actually the roles that women do play. So, I mean, like I mentioned, motherhood and being a wife is primary. But there's one really interesting about Hindu nationalism, which is that women are also encouraged to train and to engage in sort of physical defense skills. And this is not something I've seen in any other far right movement. Women are engaged in sort of paramilitary drill exercises and shooting. I mean, if you look at women-only Hindutva organizations, this is part of their basis of their meetings is sort of engaging in sort of these combat training skills. And I think this is really fascinating. But here's the thing: these Hindutva women are only allowed to do this only because they are seen to defend themselves against the hypersexual Muslim man. Like, it's only permitted.
The canard, yes, the canard, right?
Yeah. And the thing is, like, it's all against protection against the Muslim man, but there's not any discussion whatsoever about the sort of patriarchal and misogynist circles that are expressed to them by Hindu men as well, right? So I'm not trying to make an excuse here, but I am trying to point out that there's a very sort of one-sided explanation for what allows these women to participate in these physical exercises. And the other thing about Hindu nationalism is, because it is a very sort of, the thing about Hindu nationalism is that women are allowed to participate in public spaces because they are seen as the promoters of the ideology. So we have seen in the past, particularly in the 90s, women that were inciting violent riots and speeches that were recorded on cassettes, if you believe it, and sort of distributed out for propaganda purposes. And I would stress that while women's roles in Hindu nationalism is to be mothers, they are allowed into public spaces because they are seen to advocate for an ideology and a movement that is seen to be pure and sort of emphasizes the purity within that. So there's certain restrictions towards sort of how much they can sort of be in public and sort of be active in these roles.
Well, and one unique thing, if people are like, oh, well, what is Hindutva compared to all these other ideologies, all that's facing the world? Well, they actually have had the terrorists females, Pragya Thakur, actually become BJP politicians. The actual not the fringe group of guys in the mountains, like the actual bombers. Ladies, if we're going to talk about the Maya Kanani, ladies that are BJP politicians.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I wouldn't say necessarily that violence is justified solely through, let's say, far-right movements. I mean, if you look at jihadism, it's there as well, right? It's about obtaining the sort of salvation. But when it comes to the far right, it's interesting because I feel like with an ideology like this, it all the pieces of the puzzle have to be there to work, right? And it's sort of like if you take out one piece of the puzzle, the ideology sort of completely falls apart. And that's sort of how Hindu nationalism is able to operate and to sort of it's a very, like all far right movements, they're reactionary, which means that they're always reacting to something rather than, they're always sort of looking back and reacting to something or to some event. And whether that be this type of revisionist history that you described earlier about, the sort of the golden age and sort of rewriting history through textbooks or whatnot, to just sort of the mundane everyday events that sort of might spark a type of confrontation or so forth, right? Like if we look at all far right movements and Hindu nationalism specifically, it's always reacting to something that had happened. And so I think, this is something that's quite unique to sort of understanding how violence then gets justified, because it's building upon a legacy and a history of reacting to these supposed harms that have been done in the name of absolving that.
And it's academic discourse and historical discourse that helps fix that, and religious discourse and, open discourse. And you mentioned that, there are so many strands to this. There's so much going on. There's so many parts.
Like I often say it's a movement, but it's more than just a movement. I think it's I don't know. People who aren't very ideological can still sort of participate in it, even though like they, maybe somebody joined the RSS because they just had a friend that was in it and they don't know anything about Hindu nationalism, right? Absolutely. I mean, this is the thing about all type of, this is something that we see across all far right spaces, I guess, is this that, people just, it's all driven by relationships. People, we talk so much about ideology today because, that's the focus of the paper, but it doesn't do just to only look at ideology. It looks to, it's important to look at, communities or friendships and these sorts of personal relationships that get people into these movements and stuff. So.
Yeah, there's a fascinating picture of the Namo Again party in California, this very nice living room, all these people with the Modi t-shirt hanging out and everything. You get the Trump hats and everything. Yeah, it really is a movement. A lot of these, most aren't going to know the details of Savarkar and Nazism and all this stuff, but Hindutva is, and American exceptionalism, Zionism, all these things are just these all-encompassing systems that just hug you in the warm embrace of the tradition, and it's scary to me. But from the outside, we could see that. From the inside, you have your own perspective. We all have our own perspective. I'd like to wrap it up with the beautifully worded conclusion to your article. Conclusion of your paper really says it all. This article fills a lacuna in the scholarship concerning right-wing extremism by situating within it the ideological, historical, and organizational dimensions of Hindutva. It begins by highlighting a theoretical and empirical gap in studies of right-wing extremism as largely limited to European and North American case studies, and argues that Western scholars have misrepresented Hindutva in India as a type of religious extremism. This interpretation stems from misunderstanding Hindutva as a religious phenomenon rather than as the politicization of religion in which being Hindu is equated with an ethno-nationalist ideology. I recommend you read it. Thank you so much for getting in touch with me, Dr. Leidig. I believe everyone can find your work right on your website and right on the kind of Google Scholar and all that stuff. I recommend they check it out. It's just evianeleidig.com. Also Intersect to learn about the Islamophobia and all that. But any official plugs or any last word, what you're working on, or any links you'd like to shout out before we wrap it up?
Besides my website, definitely check me out on Twitter at Eviane Leidig. That's where I keep up a lot of my ongoing research and reflections and commentary and so forth. So yeah, thanks for tuning in.